Good morning and welcome to the today's webinar for improving data governance and speeding up discovery with Azure, Purview and Power BI. If you've just joined us, this is the second in our series for confident decision making with Power BI. First session we talked a bit about Power BI, some of the basics around that, how you use analytics visualization, and a bit of how you then deploy and license that as well. Today, we'll go into more about data governance, and the future sessions that we'll come to back at the end, coming up the next fortnight, and then 2 weeks in from that one is around machine learning, Power BI, and then the transition to make use of data in Azure. A bit of housekeeping before we kick off. If you have any questions during today's session, please use the Q&A panel available to you in Teams. We'll pause during the session and have a Q&A at the end as well for anything that you might be thinking about. Today's session will be recorded and will be distributed as part of any links that we talk about today in a follow-up email after today's session. And please stick around. We have a special offer at the end for those who are attending today or have registered to help you with your data governance journey. So my name is Peter Hayden. I'm the Solution Sales Specialist for Data Analytics and Data3. And this morning I'm joined by Blair Franklin, who is our Technical Solutions Specialist. Good morning, Blair.
Good morning, Peter.
We're excited to take you through a bit about today around what is governance, just to set the understanding around what that looks like. The governance for BI, Power BI, Blair will talk about how you apply that inside of Power BI. I'll come back and talk to you around Azure Purview, the new exciting service from Microsoft, and how that works with Power BI in more detail. And Blair will come back and talk about some of the best practices before we finish off with some Q&A and that special offer I mentioned. So to start things off, let's understand what does governance mean? What does data governance mean? And there are certainly some very wordy definitions. This is one from the Data Governance Institute that is on the Microsoft website. It talks around data governance around sort of rights and responsibilities, accountabilities for managing your processes, or models, how and when, and so on. To simplify that, I like to think about really what data governance means. It's the guidelines and the policies you have to support your organizational objectives, your business objectives for managing using data. And so with that in mind, we think about that the data governance required to really help you be successful with data aligned to the outcomes you need. And one way to think about it, if you're familiar with this PPT model, which is a people process technology model, which has been around for a very long time in the IT industry, to think about what does success with new solutions or systems look like. And a lot of us are technologists and think about the technology side of that, but we understand there's a balance around the people that need to operate and use those solutions, as well as a process that help manage that. And understand where governance fits. It really is around this process lens. There's a range of things that make that up, and governance is one of those that's really important to consider. And so therefore it's important when we think about Power BI as well. Now, you may be thinking, do I really need data governance? And a lot of clients that we talk to, certainly it's something that's coming more in the mind. And it's probably because we're starting to see clients with the shift of the change of being more driven by making data-driven decisions, we need to rely on that data. And if we can't rely on that data because there's decisions made on poor data or poor data quality, then data governance can help to understand where our single sources of truth are and validate and vet that data and make sure it's understood and shared across the organisation. Data governance can help manage risk and compliance. Again, hear a lot of conversations where organisations don't understand where their customer data is that they need to be able to track and manage and show to auditors and validate that we have a good understanding and manage our data really well. And the biggest one, I think, is the operational inefficiencies that come by having poor data governance, and that also it lies to lack of productivity. And there's some stats to really sort of hone that message in. The first one is from the United States Geological Service, one of the science arms of the US government. They say that poor data quality, redundant data and lost data can get companies 15 to 25%, or cost 15 to 25% of their operating budget, which is quite significant. ISACA, so the Information Systems Audit Control Association, who manage the CMMI model, so that 52% of organisations lack data confidence. Because believe a lack of data confidence increases the threat of regulatory penalties. And again, we're seeing that when we're hearing the stories around audits happening, and then fines are likely to be imposed unless they can manage their data. From Gartner, they say that more than half organisations lack a formal data governance framework and dedicated budget. And I certainly agree, there's more than half the organisations we talk to don't have those formal governance structures in place. And lastly, from McKinsey, an average of 30% of employees' total enterprise time spent on non-value tasks because of poor data quality, which relates to that productivity with data I said in the previous slide. So data governance serves a really important role for efficiency of data, making decisions and being productive. Before we go into Power BI, I just want to show the relationship between governance and what Microsoft calls system oversight. So governance is that definition had before around the policies and procedures for use in managing your organisational data. It's also to maintain the regulatory, legislative, contractual compliance that you might have. When we think about system oversight, another way to think about it is it's the administration of system. In this case, administration of Power BI. And the governance policies that come through influence what the administrators need to do, which is how to enact those governance guidelines. So it's a really important way that gives direction to those administrators of how to best manage those systems, including the processes required for that, and then through that application of those governance policies through to managing the system allows for broader adoption of Power BI across the organisation. So Blair, I'll hand over to you. Please take us through a bit about governance for Power BI.
Okay, welcome everyone. So if we jump into governance for Power BI now, so we're going to kind of cover the Dataset Workspaces, the Report Workspaces, and the lineage of how it all sort of ties together. This diagram here, it's one I quite like because it shows the end-to-end of how our source databases and files are used by our shared datasets, and if they're on-prem, they've got a gateway in between. And then those shared data sets are then used by multiple different reports through multiple different sort of report workspaces. And so on the next few slides, I'm going to just deep dive a bit more into what these are. So yeah, next slide. So first we look at the Dataset Workspace. So we have the workspace ownership. So who owns this workspace? So it's a shared dataset workspace. It's used by all business functions and it's split out by dev, UAT, prod, or you've got other environments. Who owns this is usually going to be IT, technology, some sort of technology-driven part of the business. The workspace security should be managed by Active Directory groups, and the group should correspond to the roles within that workspace as well. So workspace admin, content admin, dataset creator, and dataset viewer. In Power BI, the content admin is called a member and the dataset creator is called a contributor. When we start looking down into dataset sharing, the dataset is shared with the report creator and above for the relevant workspaces. What I mean by relevant workspaces is the reporting workspaces. So we have the dataset workspace, and then we have our different reporting workspaces. And of course, data protection requirements is always important. We need to be able to classify and label our sensitive data, need to be able to enforce government policies, we need to be able to monitor and protect users using the cloud app security, and of course, empower security administrators. Next slide, please. So now we step into the different report workspaces. So workspace separation and workspace ownership land with the business function and a logical separation. What I mean by that is the business function and the logical separation kind of tie in hand on how you're going to create and separate the reporting workspaces. It might be by department, it might be by team, or it might be by project. They will then be separated again by environment. Workspace security, again, it's everything is managed through Azure Active Directory groups. When it comes to report sharing, rule of thumb is only share what's required. So what I mean by that is within your workspace, you have multiple reports. Don't share everything if you don't need to. Just share the report that is required. And there's a few different ways to be able to share out different reports. You can use the Power BI apps, you can use SharePoint, or you can embed your reports into an external website. And for sharing your reports, again, use AAD. Use the groups and manage it within Active Directory. And then data protection requirements, again, it's very similar. Next slide. Now, we've talked about the workspaces and how we can secure and govern our workspaces. Now we'll talk a little bit about the lineage within Power BI. So how does it all tie together? Within the Power BI workspace, you'll see up the top a little view button. If you click on that, you see a drop down, you see lineage. Click on that and you'll now get something similar to what you see here. So here I have two different examples. So one in the top is a reasonably straightforward one. So we have a data set pulling from an OData connection and a SharePoint connection. We then have a report of that data set. The one in the lower bottom is a bit more complex and probably a bit more realistic on what most of us do day to day. At the top line of it, you can see there's a SQL Server connection, which is going into a data set, which has the marketing model report of it. Then in the next step down, we have multiple different sources going through multiple pipelines, which again go into another pipeline, which has the data set, then the accounts reports, and then the one at the end is the dashboard, which ties 3 different reports together. Next slide, please. Now, when we jump into Purview, which is the governance solution for Azure, you also have your lineage in there as part of connecting in Power BI. So how it appears is very similar. You've got your database, your data flows, your data sets, reports, dashboards. It all kind of comes together the same. The difference is by pulling that information into Purview, you now have it in a centralized place with your data, all your database information, your data factory information. It's all in a centralized location, so it's a lot easier to see in one place. The diagram on the right, it's just kind of a holistic view of how this ties together. You have your data sources going to your data flow, going to your data set, your reports of your data set, and your dashboards of your reports. Next slide, please. And now I'll hand over back to Pete to take you actually through Azure Purview itself.
Thanks, Blair. And we're going to sort of use all the concepts you saw then in Blair's examples to help you understand around how you can use tools like Lineage out of the box with a service like Azure Purview. So if you haven't heard of Azure Purview, it's a relatively new service from Microsoft. It's a unified data governance service, and that helps you maximize the business value of your data. And what Purview does is a range of things. I'll pick some of these out that's fairly relevant for the audience today. First one is a discovery of your data. Many organizations have lots of data sets, but aren't sure where data lives exactly or what data sources contain what type of information around their employees, their customers, products, and the like. So discovery is really powerful that you search around that, as well as classifying. It helps with that compliance requirement, understand where you might have at-risk data stored in your environment. You can apply rules to only scan and pick that up. The lineage to show that relationship is very powerful as well. And that allows you to then act like data controls, report on data, missing metadata, and understand how data works and flows through your environment. Now, Purview matters for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is finding that data. So you don't report on, you can't understand what to report on until you know what there is. And sometimes having missing data is part of that bad data equation I talked about earlier. Clients often see that there's a lot of duplication in their environment. And so by being able to scan your environment and understand where that data is, you start identifying where you have multiple pieces of information and help understanding, well, where's the source of truth around information, say, about your customers. And because now you can understand your data and see the connections between them, you have traceability through your environment. And it starts to let you think about the relationship between those and helps build trust to know I'm pulling my data from the source and I see it comes upstream from somewhere else that I know is a true source from our organisation. And with that visibility, you can help manage your risk profile by find information, help you manage those changes, understand the downstream impacts from a change upstream. So imagine that view that blared on the screen before, where you've got those dashboards that an executive might be using and you're making a change to a source system. That could have potential real impact. I'll show you a very simple example in a moment. And because you can improve the overall posture around your data, it helps build data culture, because now data is, or finding of data is available to you across your organisation. So the example of an impact of change, this is one that came from a colleague of mine, and it was pulling data through Power BI as a general refresh, and then one day it started failing. He asked for some help, and we looked at the error message. It's there in the red box is that a source system change, a column change, no longer exists and broke the downstream reports. This one wasn't a big deal, but just as a really simple example to show that a rather seamless change can actually have an impact to end users, and that's really important to ensure they have. We talk about the trust of the data, just about the experience of Power BI. That it is, it works, and we don't get those negative connotations, to help you with the adoption of Power BI. So let me take you through a couple of examples to show you about Purview before we go deep into how it relates with Power BI. And just for timing, I've just got these as screenshots to really talk through it. But this is the home screen of Purview. This is an administrative view, and you can log in, you can browse your assets. A business user can have access to this as well, and they'll see a slightly condensed view on here. Just want to also call out that Purview is scanning your information of your data, but it's not pulling or copying your data in. And when people are using this, we're really seeing all the descriptors and the metadata of the data to understand more about that. You'll see what I mean in a moment, but they can't see the data underlying. So when, for example, we search on employee, we might we'll get the following search results. And we can see where this information might be, but can't see what's inside that table. So on the screen here, we have a range of tables that are available to us. On the left, there are a set of filters that we can use to narrow down what we're searching for. It might be by source, by classification, or perhaps a contact in this case. If we were to say filter on that date of birth field as a classification, automatic classification that Purview has done in this database, it's narrowed it down to a single table within our Azure SQL database. If we then explore this further, we can start to see that metadata or descriptors for our data asset. Let me just guide you through what's on the screen here. On the right-hand side, we have the hierarchy, which shows us that our employee table and where it fits inside of the schema and the database and the SQL server that houses this information. We're also able to tag elements with glossary terms that we define inside of Purview. So things like a dictionary that you can curate, because there are many terms that might be specific to your organisation or your industry that is commonly used that will be useful when you're trying to find data based on these terms. We also have classifications. So these classifications work by scanning through the types of field, types of data that you have in your assets, applies a set of heuristics and rules that can be pattern matching, or it might be a dictionary of product IDs to then sort of help understand how this schema might be classified. And you can apply your own custom rules, of course, and there are many out of the box, such as credit card numbers or Australian tax file numbers. In this case, we've got the date of birth, and when we go then into the schema for this table, we can see that we have that classification applied to that birth date column in this table. Just to show you, this is on a different data asset. We have contacts. this is another way to understand and build or break down those silos and build the collaboration in the organisation. If I was searching for employee data and I wasn't part of HR, I now know who the experts are in the organisation and who I can approach in terms of who owns that. If I need to understand access or maybe put some compliance over that, some controls over that data to make sure it is secure. So what I want to do now is just a bit about Purview is show you what it looks like in the context of Power BI. This is an animation, so I'll get my mouse across to start this playing. So what we're doing here is browsing our data assets, and we have Power BI as an asset across our other tables and storage accounts we have in this example. We have a single workspace called B3 Marketing that we can then click on, and we get a very similar view to what we saw with a SQL table before. We have the hierarchy, we've got properties, extended properties if we need to have those included, no context on this one. And we can see the related assets with this workspace, including those data sets, data flows, and reports. So we're going to then look at the first report here and deep dive into that and look at, again, very similar. We have the hierarchy has been updated. We can apply the terms that I mentioned before. But what's really interesting, I'm just going to go through to the contacts and then click through onto the lineage. You see the right assets there. We have a view now of, like Blair showed you before, of our report in context of where this data is coming from for Power BI. Now we can see the data sets and the data flows in here as well, and we can switch and move into further down the line. If I let's forward a bit and look at, say, the data set. We can zoom in and see that. If we then look at the data flow, we can see this one data flow isn't just one data set in one report, it's actually feeding into multiple data sets. So that's really important to give you an understanding of your data. In our testing, what we've found is that when using the lineage view in Power BI, we get a really rich view of where our data sources are downstream to the Power BI reports and dashboards. If we look at from the database lineage view and the database asset, we don't always see those connections down to Power BI. So this is part of, I think, a hopefully upcoming roadmap feature for Azure Purview that we look forward to, so you can get a really good view. And why it's important to consider lineage inside of Purview rather than just the view inside of Power BI, because it does provide a way, as well as explaining, for you to see all your assets, or across all your assets all at once. So I don't need to have access into this workspace to see these reports exist. I can't see the reports, but I know they're there now. And I can start a conversation, save that duplication of effort, and I can have a conversation with who owns these around that. So that's why it's powerful to have this as part of that a broader governance sort of view of relationships with your data. Okay. So just to finalise a question we get about when we're having conversations around Azure Purview and with Power BI is around what does that look like in terms of security, and this is across all data assets. To actually bring in Power BI specifically to Azure Purview is quite straightforward. Just having a security group set up in Azure Active Directory. There's identity that's created as part of the Purview provisioning process. And we actually have a whole webinar that showcases Purview more, as well as getting Azure Purview provisioned, and we'll link that into the follow-up email following the session as well. You can have a look at. But once you've got that the identity in the security group, you can apply that in your tenancy. So there are two areas where you can have APIs connectivity. The first is allow the service principals to use Power BI APIs. You don't need to turn that on. That's on the left, but you do need to turn on the one that's a read-only APIs. So Purview is doing read-only access into your environment to do that, and you can apply that to a specific security group like you see on the screen there. It helps maintain, there's no change going to be affected by having Purview scan your environment as well. So, Blair, I'll hand back to you to talk about some of the governance best practices, please.
Okay, so if we can jump to the next slide. So here we're going to start talking about sort of content ownership and management. And this is all around your workspaces, your data sets, your reports, who owns it? So who owns the data? Who takes ownership of the reports? And that kind of leads conversation into how do you set up your workspaces and how are reports going to be, or reports and data sets going to be developed and maintained going forward. So at a high level, we kind of fall into these three areas here. We have the business-led self-service BI, the managed self-service BI, and enterprise BI. The business-led self-service BI is where the business user, they kind of own everything. So it's a decentralized model where everything is created and maintained by the business or by the subject matter experts. When you go to the other side of the scale, the enterprise BI, this is very centralized. So the IT department or business intelligence department, they own and maintain the data sets and reports. So they kind of create and own everything. And then the managed self-service BI is kind of that middle slice where the data sets will be data sets and workspaces will be owned and maintained by the IT team, while the reports and the sharing of the reports will be maintained by the sort of the business users. Can we jump to the next slide? So now I'm just going to go into a bit more detail on each of these areas. So the business-led self-service BI. As I said, the business users create and distribute the datasets and reports. What I have seen personally with this sort of design is you tend to end up with one workspace where everything's just thrown in there. You hear me talk about datasets and reports a lot. What I also see a lot of is when it's business-led, you don't have that separation. The data set is kind of created as part of the Power BI report, which means there's no reusability. You also quite often see the access is not managed by Azure Active Directory. It's usually managed at the individual user level, and there's often very little governance in place. You generally end up with a bit of a spaghetti workspace. You kind of everything is just thrown into one workspace, and there's not a lot of governance. There's not a lot of planning, and because the people creating these are business users, they are subject matter experts, but they're not technical people. There's limited technical ability. Now, the good side of this though is because it is business users creating it, the look and the feel of the report. So the graphs chosen, the visuals chosen, the colors used, what is represented. It's exactly what you actually want because you are designing yourself, so you are getting what you want. Next slide, please. So we jump to the other side with enterprise BI. So here, the technology team develops and maintains the datasets and the reports. Because it is technology run and because it is usually designed at a larger scale, there's typically good governance in place. Because it is designed by technology people, the datasets will also be well designed. So you will get those more complex calculations in your dataset. The downside to this is because it is technology designing the reports and they may not know the data, the reports may not actually meet the business requirements. And again, if this is a larger organization and you've got multiple business units and all the requests are going to technology or IT team to create the reports, there's going to be a longer turnaround due to IT being sort of overloaded or overwhelmed. Jump to the next slide. And this is where your managed self-service BI comes in. Managed self-service BI is where you want to be aiming. It's a blended approach. It's the best of both worlds. The data is owned and managed by a technical team, but the responsibility for reports and dashboards belong to creators and subject matter experts within the business units. So what this means is the shared dataset workspace and the individual business unit workspaces are created by the technical team. The shared dataset workspace and all the shared datasets within that shared dataset workspace are created by the technical team and maintained by the IT team. So they create those datasets. They'll add in the calculated columns and measures, whatever's required. But that's kind of, and then they'll expose it out to the different reporting workspaces. But that's kind of where their role stops. The business unit, so the different business unit users or the subject matter experts, will now use those data sets and they will create the reports. So the reports are created and they're also shared by these business unit users. So it means you have that good governance around the workspaces, the security and the data ownership. It's a clear line of who owns what data. As part of a data set, you have a common naming and design standard, and one data set, because it's split out from the reports, can be used across multiple reports. It also means because the business unit users are creating the reports, they have that nice structure that they can use to create them, but they know their data. They know how to use it. They can create the visualizations and the way they want them. They can make sure they have their colors in play, their themes in play. And they also, as long as they're following the right sort of conventions for sharing, they have a lot more say over how they share those reports out. Next slide, please. So this approach is often called discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. That basically means you've got discipline at the data set, but you've got a lot of flexibility around how the reports are created and shared. Next slide. So if we just sort of step back a bit, when do we actually introduce governance? Do we roll out Power BI, then introduce governance? So the issue you might have here is you're going to roll out Power BI, you're going to get everything kind of working, and then you're going to try to put governance over top. It's kind of take a square peg, put it in a round hole. It's not really going to work. If we look at option 2, we switch it. So you do your governance planning, you roll out your Power BI. In theory, this will work great. The problem here is you're going to if you spend too long doing your governance, you're not actually doing anything with Power BI. So, and you're getting delayed when you really don't want to be delayed, which is why we jump to option 3. We interact, we do a little bit of governance, we roll out Power BI, kind of look at it and go, does that work? Is that what we want? Maybe we could do it a little bit better here, just more governance, roll out more Power BI. And we have sort of that approach where we do a little bit of Power BI, a little bit of governance, and we kind of go to and fro until we get exactly what we need from a business perspective and also a governance perspective. Next slide. And now I'll hand back to Peter to sort of finish up.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. I think I just want to go back just a moment and just make a call out. You know, I've been, like a lot of you, have been involved in governance, involved in governance some time. And I think, Blair, fair to say, number one is a strategy a lot of organisations sort of go for, and they never get to doing governance or doing it really well. That'd be probably your experience too, Blair?
Very much. Most of the time I've seen one or two. One is you roll out your Power BI, but you never actually do your governance. Or 2 will be you spend a lot of time planning your governance and never actually roll out your Power BI.
Which is why number 3 is a really pragmatic approach for organisations to really help make sure we don't have the problems that we've seen with clients that don't have governance as part of the journey to help make sure and the messes that we've seen. So I think there's some really good learnings there that can help those on the webinar today. So that is the conclusion of the content we prepared for today. Hope that was useful if you understand a bit more around data governance and particularly around Power BI, and also how Azure Purview can be used as well to help support that as a data governance tool. In the next session, in a fortnight's time, we'll be looking to get started with some out-of-the-box machine learning available to you in Power BI, and look forward to Blair and I present that to you at that time. And the following session to finish the series for the confidence decision making with Power BI is around the tools and data framework to help modernise and migrate your data to Azure, which helps get your data ready for doing the powerful analytics that you're looking to achieve as well. For everyone who's attended, whether it's on the call live today or following up with the recording, we know that data governance is a challenging topic for a lot of people, we have an assessment standards that helps us collect some information a little bit about your environment. And with that, we'd love to invite you to do that, and we'll have a one-on-one 30-minute session with you afterwards to go through about where you're at and what sort of data governance strategies might make most sense to you, and to meet you where you're at to understand the challenging problems and provide some guidance. It's at no cost, no obligation time, and we've done with a few clients from the first session, and some really great value has been unlocked to help those who participate in those sessions to then think about what they need to do, next steps in their overall data journey. So you can use that link there, same links on this page as well. But certainly, thank you very much. Contact details for Blair and myself are there. If you have any questions, are there any questions in the Q&A, Marcel?
I've got 2 questions so far, so maybe a call out to people who are in the session if they want to post a question. Now is the time to do it. And I'll just continue with those 2 questions I have here.
Yep, great.
So the first question is, how does Azure Purview pricing work?
It's a great question, Marcel. We looked at that during, well, Purview was in the preview period, and there's some guidance. Best place at the moment to give you what I think about that is to go to the Azure Purview pricing page. And it outlines the components that make that up. So there's the Purview service itself, there's scanning and how frequently you scan, the amount of data you bring in, and there's measurements around that. I had a look earlier, and the pricing still refers to features are still in preview when it has gone generally available. So it's been really hard to sort of see, and because it only was released in September, we've probably not seen enough usage yet with clients to understand what that looks like. But we have noted that from the preview, where you had a minimum standard of capacity units that was might be suitable for a production deployment, you can tune that down to just a 1 capacity unit to get started in terms of an MVP or a pilot to make the most of that, and that's a cost-effective way to doing that. Other option, of course, is to reach out to yourselves or your licensing specialist to understand what that implication might be for Purview. Purview does allow you to scan across on-premises data sources as well, so you don't have to be in Azure yet. In fact, even does scans databases in AWS as well. So it's designed to be a unified governance tool. So great question around that, and it's not always the easiest to answer, but there's some guidance on the website, and that will emerge as people start using it and Microsoft refines their service offering.
Okay. So the other question I have is, so for Azure Purview to work, does all the data sources, do they need to be in Azure Cloud? Or?
No, so that's a good question. So there's a list of connectors that we'll link to as part of this as well, that gives you a list of all of the services that Purview can connect to. And a lot of them are Azure-based that they can use. I mentioned AWS before, but it also scan on-premises data sources. So if you're familiar with how Power BI Data Gateway works, where it pushes data up into Power BI service, so you have to open firewalls for Power BI to get back through. Very similar with a gateway type system. They can go across your on-premises databases. Certainly, Microsoft SQL Server is in there. I think Oracle might be covered on that as well. And if you've followed any of the new announcemements from Ignite, the Microsoft Ignite event from last week, with the new version of SQL Server, they're talking about direct connectivity with cloud so that might extend also to Purview, so that you don't have to have this middleware in place to bridge that connection. It sort of natively connects to the cloud. So a lot of innovations coming down the pipeline, and there are some requests for things like Office 365 that Purview doesn't support right at the moment, but I expect as there is usage demand from Microsoft's customer base, that there'll be more connectors coming through as well. And but things like file servers, synchronizing that to cloud is one way. You can also scan across your unstructured data assets. We didn't cover off today, but content inside of Excel documents to find where your data is as well is another way to get Purview to ingest information. So there's a lot of options and a lot to come, I believe. And one more?
Yes, I've got one more question. So the question is, does Purview only operate on Microsoft Suite products, or can it also link and connect to non-Microsoft platforms?
So there's certainly a range of non-Microsoft platforms as well. So that connector list that will send through. There is Oracle. I think there's Teradata. I don't know whether you've got any others that you're aware of that will connect to, but there are a range of other non-Microsoft suite systems as well. I think even S3 buckets in AWS is part of that as well. Do you any others come to mind?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I think it's, for the most part, it's databases and storage accounts.
Yeah. So certainly there's a list of those there that I will point you to with the follow-up email. Thanks for the question. Okay, well that's it for questions. Appreciate the attendance. As I said, look forward to the next session coming up. If you would like to use our assessment, please do so, and we'll have a one-on-one session. And thank you for joining today, and we'll see you at the next webinar.